There is a story most people know. Germany lost the First World War. The victors gathered at Versailles and imposed a bill that could never be paid. Berlin printed money to cover the debt. The currency collapsed. People needed wheelbarrows to carry enough marks to buy a loaf of bread. The humiliation radicalized a nation. And from that humiliation came Adolf Hitler. That is the story. It appears in introductory economics courses. It is cited in central bank policy papers. It is repeated in Parliament whenever a government considers deficit spending. It is one of the most durable cautionary tales in the history of modern finance. There is just one problem with this story. Almost every element of it is wrong, incomplete, or pointing at the wrong cause entirely. The records of 1923 tell a different story, and it is considerably more disturbing. By November of 1923, one egg cost 320 billion marks. That number is accurate. But the sequence of decisions that made it possible, who made them, why they made them, and who benefited when it was over, that is not a story about Versailles. It is a story about a war debt that existed before any peace treaty was signed. A political choice made in January 1923 that detonated the currency deliberately, and an accounting ledger from 1924 that recorded the outcome of all of it in figures that almost no one reads anymore. To understand what actually happened, you have to go back not to 1919, but to the first week of August, 1914. On the 4th of August of that year, the German Reichstag voted unanimously to fund the war. Every party voted yes, including the Social Democrats, who had spent decades opposing imperial militarism. The Kaiser called it the Burgfrieden, the civil truce. Germany would stand together. What the Reichstag also voted for, without quite framing it that way, was a particular theory of how a war could be paid for. The German imperial government immediately suspended the gold standard. The mark was no longer tied to gold reserves. It was tied to credit, specifically to the belief that Germany would win the war quickly, extract reparations from France and Britain, and use those reparations to pay down the debt. Every bond issued, every mark printed, was a bet on victory. The war took 4 years instead of 4 months. By the autumn of 1918, Germany had accumulated a domestic war debt of approximately 150 billion marks. It had printed an extraordinary volume of paper currency, backed by nothing except the presumption of future conquest. The inflation rate had already doubled prices since 1914. The machinery of monetary expansion was not a post-war emergency measure. It was the war itself. When Germany lost, the logic of that financial architecture inverted completely. The reparations flow reversed direction. Instead of Paris paying Berlin, Berlin would pay Paris. The entire system had been built to run one way. It now had to run the other. This is the context that the standard Versailles narrative erases. The Treaty of Versailles was signed in June 1919. The total reparations burden, fixed in 1921 at the London Schedule of Payments, came to 132 billion gold marks. That number was large. It is also smaller than the indemnity Germany had extracted from France after the Franco-Prussian War of 1871, which was set at 5 billion francs, the equivalent in real terms of roughly 20 billion 1921 marks, plus decades of compounding industrial advantage. Germany had collected its victory debt in 1871. It had spent that money building an industrial empire. The difference in 1919 was not the principle of reparations. The difference was that Germany had lost. Historians who have spent careers in the Bundesarchiv, Germany's national archive, argue consistently that the hyperinflation of 1923 was not caused by the reparations bill. The payments actually made to the Allies between 1919 and 1922 represented a fraction of total German government expenditure. The deficit was driven primarily by domestic commitments, civil service salaries, veterans' benefits, subsidies to industries converting back from war production. The German government was spending money it did not have on problems that existed entirely within its own borders. Versailles was the political explanation. The financial crisis was older, deeper, and more structural than any single treaty clause. What changed in January 1923 was not the cause of the collapse. What changed was the accelerant. On the 11th of January, 1923, French and Belgian troops crossed into the Ruhr Valley. The occupation was justified under the reparations framework. Germany had defaulted on timber and telegraph pole deliveries, and France's Prime Minister, Raymond Poincaré, decided to collect payment in kind. 100,000 troops moved into the industrial heartland of Germany, the region that produced 80% of the country's coal and more than 70% of its steel and pig iron. The German government, led by Chancellor Wilhelm Kuno, responded within days. It declared a policy of passive resistance. German workers in the Ruhr were ordered to stop work. Civil servants were ordered to refuse cooperation with the occupying authorities. The mines went silent. The railways stopped running. The factories across the country that depended on Ruhr coal began to shut down. This was a political decision. It was also a financial one. And no one in the Kuno government appears to have calculated the arithmetic seriously before committing to it. Passive resistance meant the government would have to pay the wages of millions of workers who were producing nothing. Railway employees, miners, civil servants, police, teachers, local government officials, all of them ordered to resist. All of them expecting to be paid. There was no mechanism to pay them except the printing press. The Reichsbank had been printing money since 1914. By early 1923, the inflation rate was already severe, but the Ruhr crisis transformed a chronic condition into an acute emergency. From January to November of 1923, the amount of money in circulation in Germany increased by a factor of roughly 7.3 trillion. Not 7.3 times. 7.3 trillion times. Hjalmar Schacht, who would later be appointed to fix the crisis, was direct about this in his published memoirs. He wrote that the occupation of the Ruhr provided a political pretext for what economists had already made inevitable. The underlying monetary architecture was already broken. The Ruhr occupation simply removed the last remaining restraints on the expansion of credit. Chancellor Kuno resigned in August 1923. His successor, Gustav Stresemann, inherited a country in free fall. In the month of August alone, the exchange rate moved from roughly 1 million marks to the dollar to over 100 million marks to the dollar. By September, it stood at 1 billion. By October, 25 billion. By mid-November, it would reach 4 trillion, 200 billion marks per dollar. The measuring instruments could barely keep pace with what they were measuring. Here is where the images come from. The photographs of wheelbarrows piled with currency. The newspaper headlines denominated in billions. The stories of workers demanding to be paid twice a day, carrying their wages to the market in baskets and suitcases because by afternoon the prices had changed again. Restaurants printed new menus between breakfast and lunch. A haircut was priced before you sat down and renegotiated before you stood up. These stories circulate endlessly, and some of them are exaggerated, and some of them are not. The Reichsbank genuinely burned bundles of old banknotes as heating fuel for its boilers. The calculation was straightforward. Coal cost more per unit of thermal energy than the currency printed on paper. The material substance of the money, the paper, the ink, the labor of printing, was worth less than its weight as tinder. 5 billion marks burned, as fuel is not a metaphor. It is a documented Reichsbank transaction in which incineration was the more rational economic choice. The social effects were precise and deeply unequal. People who held savings accounts were destroyed. The German middle class, the educated professionals, the civil servants, The teachers and shopkeepers who had purchased war bonds as a patriotic duty between 1914 and 1918 found those bonds now worth fractions of their original value. A war bond purchased in 1916 for 1,000 marks with the intent of funding a child's university education was worth by November 1923 less than the paper on which it was printed. People who held debt found something completely different. Hugo Stinnes was the largest private industrialist in Germany during the Weimar period. He had spent the war years and the immediate post-war years acquiring companies on borrowed money, loans denominated in fixed mark amounts at fixed mark interest rates. By 1923, the Stinnes industrial empire controlled 4,554 separate enterprises: coal mines, steel works, shipping companies, newspapers, hotels, paper mills, ocean liners. The loans that had financed this acquisition were now evaporating. A mortgage taken out in 1921 for 10 million marks, due in 5 years, would be repaid in 1926 at the nominal sum in marks, now worth, in real purchasing power, an arithmetic rounding error. The physical assets remained. The debts dissolved. The question of who actually won in 1923 is more disturbing than any wheelbarrow photograph, because the answer changes everything you thought you knew about what came next. Stinnes was not alone. Across German heavy industry, a pattern emerged that contemporary economists noticed and documented. Companies with real assets, land, machinery, physical production capacity, emerged from the hyperinflationary period in significantly stronger positions than they had entered it. Their pre-war and early post-war debt had been effectively cancelled by inflation. Their physical capital was intact. The word that German economists and government officials began using in the official reports of 1924 was Inflationsgewinner, the winners of inflation. It was not a neutral description. It appeared in parliamentary committee transcripts alongside demands for investigation and accountability. Nothing substantive followed. Meanwhile, the people who had done exactly what prudent economic orthodoxy advised, who had saved their money, purchased government bonds, held liquid currency reserves, were financially annihilated. The hyperinflation of 1923 was the largest single peacetime transfer of wealth in German history. The mechanism was the printing press, but the architecture of who benefited and who did not was not random. It was structurally predictable from the moment the Ruhr resistance began. And then it stopped. On the 15th of November, 1923, the Rentenmark was introduced. 1 Rentenmark was exchangeable for 1 trillion old marks. Within 2 weeks, prices stabilized. This is the fact that most popular accounts of the Weimar hyperinflation omit entirely, because it is deeply inconvenient for the standard lesson. If hyperinflation is caused by a fundamental breakdown of social trust, by an irreversible destruction of monetary confidence, by the kind of structural damage that takes a generation to repair, then why did it end in 15 days? The Rentenmark was backed by something entirely novel. Not gold. Germany had almost none remaining. Not foreign exchange. The Rentenmark was secured by a mortgage on all agricultural and industrial land in Germany. The entire productive capacity of the country was pledged as collateral. If the new currency failed, creditors would theoretically hold a proportional lien on German farmland and factories. This was not a legally sound instrument. A mortgage on all of Germany could not be enforced in any conventional court. The arrangement had no meaningful precedent in monetary history. It worked anyway. It worked because Schacht, appointed as currency commissioner in November 1923, convinced the Reichsbank to stop expanding the money supply on the same day the Rentenmark was issued. The promise was credible not because of the collateral. The collateral was largely fictional, but because the behavior changed. The printing stopped. And because it stopped, And because the new currency maintained a fixed exchange rate against the dollar, and because the government simultaneously announced genuine reductions in expenditure and civil service employment, the market chose to believe it. The farmers who had been refusing for months to accept paper marks for grain brought their produce back to market within days of the Rentenmark introduction. The exchange rate held. The crisis ended so quickly that economists writing a year later were still struggling to explain the mechanism. What it demonstrated, and this is the part that the myth consistently suppresses, is that the hyperinflation of 1923 was not a force of nature. It was a policy choice. A sequence of policy choices made by identifiable people with identifiable interests that produced identifiable winners and losers. And when different people made different choices, it stopped. The simplified version of this story survived because it was useful. Print money, get hyperinflation, lose your democracy. It is clean. It is short. It has identifiable villains: the reckless government, the foreign creditors, the printing press itself. It converts a complex sequence of politically motivated decisions into a portable economic law, applicable in any parliament where a central bank is being pressured to accommodate government spending. Every major central bank in the developed world spent the second half of the 20th century citing Weimar as justification for monetary independence. The Bundesbank, the West German central bank, was constitutionally designed with the memory of 1923 explicitly embedded in its mandate. The 2% inflation target adopted by the European Central Bank at its founding in 1998 was written in the long shadow of that year. German monetary orthodoxy is one of the structuring forces of European economic policy to this day, and that orthodoxy is grounded in a version of events that is, at minimum, radically incomplete. The real mechanism: an industrial territory occupied by foreign troops, a government that chose to finance mass passive resistance through deliberate monetary expansion, an inflationary spiral that canceled the debts of asset-owning industrialists while destroying the savings of everyone else, followed by a currency reform that succeeded not because of its legal architecture, but because a single official stopped the printing and changed the terms of belief. That story requires too many qualifications for a clean moral lesson. It implicates too many parties. It raises questions about whose interests a monetary crisis actually serves that are uncomfortable to raise in the institutions built on the simplified version. The Inflationsgewinner did not appear prominently in the Nuremberg trial record. They do not appear in Marshall Plan histories. They appear in the 1924 parliamentary transcripts of the German Reichstag and in the contemporaneous reports of the Reparations Commission, and they have been largely invisible in the popular telling of the Weimar period ever since. The word itself, Inflationsgewinner, does not appear in standard English language economics textbooks. Here is what the record actually shows when you go back to it. People who opened savings accounts in 1916 and followed every piece of conventional financial wisdom available to them were destroyed by 1923. People who borrowed heavily in marks to acquire physical assets in 1919 and 1920, when the outcome of the monetary expansion was already structurally visible to anyone reading the Reichsbank's own balance sheet, emerged wealthier, in real terms, than they had been at the start of the war. The wheelbarrow photographs are real. The eggs at 320 billion marks are real. The bonfires of currency in the Reichsbank boilers are real. What is not in the photographs is the accounting ledger of 1924, where the transfer of wealth from those who had saved to those who had borrowed is documented in columns of figures, tabulated, noted in official reports, raised briefly in parliamentary committees, and then set aside in favor of a cleaner narrative about the dangers of printing money. The story that got taught is not wrong about the wheelbarrows. It is wrong about almost everything else that mattered. If you want more stories where the official record contradicts the lesson being taught, where the numbers in the archives tell a different story than the summary in the textbook, subscribe. The archives keep correcting themselves. The popular version tends to stay the same.